Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome back to Doctor Who Literature. We're a member of the Direction Point Doctor Who podcast network. My name is Jason. This week and next week are both episodes covering the October 1987 Target releases. This week, we are covering the last of the Companions of Doctor Who books. Unlike the others, this was not an original story, but is in fact a novelization itself of the 1981 Christmas special K-9 and Company. This book is not numbered, but it came out the exact same day as Target book number 121, The Ambassadors of Death. Since there is a novelization that will not come out for a while yet in our publication order and is numbered out of order, that means that book 121 and its unnumbered companion are episodes 120 and 120A of this podcast. For both October 1987 episodes, I will have two guests for the week. This week, two very good friends from the American Doctor Who convention circuit, Drew and Brent from the Who and Company podcast. Drew and Brent had me on a few months ago to discuss my Doctor Who fandom and the American science fiction / gothic horror soap opera Dark Shadows, about which I have discussed many times on Doctor Who Literature. I will put a link to that in the show notes. Drew and Brent are phenomenal guests, and I can promise you this will not be the last time you hear from them, even though it is sadly the very first time that I've had them on in all the time that I have had this podcast. This week, as I am recording, you may be listening far in the future, but the 2024 Summer Olympics are happening in Paris, and that's certainly taking up a lot of TV viewing in the Doctor Who Literature household. There has been a very unfortunate controversy spread by the darkest corners of the internet, almost certainly Russian propaganda, about the Algerian female boxer, Aman Khalif. Really an inspirational story. Horrible innuendo being spread about her very maliciously, but she is doing a phenomenal job at the Olympics, and she has qualified for a medal. As of the time of recording, we don't know which one, but I have watched some of her matches frame by frame. Excellent technique. I am sort of an amateur student of that sort of thing, and I certainly hope that after all she's been put through, she wins the gold. Let's go over to listener mail. First, we have a letter from friend of the show, John Featonby. John writes in response to episode 118, The Reign of Terror. Smashing podcast as always. Thanks to you and Denise for the shout out. I would be incredibly proud to be considered an ancestor of Doctor Who Literature and Trap 1. Haven't the kids turned out well? Keep them coming, sir. Kindest regards, John. John, always a pleasure to hear from you, and I hope we talk soon. Also have a note from co-producer of this podcast, Jim Sangster. Just wanted to say I really enjoyed the Buffy chat. That is referencing last week's episode, Doctor Who Literature Presents Buffy the Vampire Slayer with Jason and Callie. Back to the email. Such a smart and enthusiastic guest. Wherever did you find her? Huh, that's a very good question, Jim. I don't know where Callie's smarts come from, but they sure don't come from me. And lastly, we have an email from longtime listener, Brian Burkhart, another longtime friend of mine from the American Doctor Who convention circuit. This is in reference to episode 115 of this podcast, and I'll point out that Brian lives in the Pennsylvania area, so geographically he and I have very different American professional sports team loyalties. Quote, listening to the Faceless Ones episode, yes, I am behind with all of my podcasts. How dare you play the Joe Carter home run call, that's from the 1993 World Series, and make me relive that moment. 3 cry-laughing emojis. I did respond to Brian that this is an equal opportunity offender podcast Baseball clips that I've played over the years include the infamous Bill Buckner play in the 1986 World Series, which executive producer David Barsky, as a Red Sox fan, was not especially happy with. And for New Yorkers, I have also posted tragic moments from the 1981 World Series about the Yankees and the 1973 World Series about the New York Mets. So if something heartbreaking has happened in baseball history, you might well hear it here on Doctor Who Literature in an upcoming episode. Brian, thanks for listening. And yes, I will try not to harsh on the Phillies too much more often. After all, they so rarely make the World Series that there's not a whole lot of bad audio clips out there about them. Speaking of Jim Sangster, Jim has been doing some yeoman's work creating video content for the YouTube channel. He has musical compositions coming up for several future episodes with videos, and he is also going back and making videos for a lot of the songs and parodies that he's written for the show over the last year or so. I will be putting those up on the YouTube channel, probably once a week on Saturdays as a prelude to the Sunday drops of the episodes. Not quite ready to do that yet, but that will be happening very soon. So keep an eye out on our YouTube channel. That's Doctor Who Literature on YouTube, at Doctor Who Novels, Dr. Who Novels. Meanwhile, it is time for K-9 and Company. Let's get to it.
They all say who is Doctor Who?
This is Tim Trelaw.
This is David J. Howe.
I'm Peter Purvis.
I am Sadie Miller.
This is Lauren Cornelius.
Larry, it's Fraser.
For all things in the Doctor Who collecting world and beyond, the Doctor Who Collectors Podcast. I'm Larry Van Mersbergen, your host, and I've been collecting for 42 years. You're listening to Doctor Who Literature on the Direction Point Podcast Network. Keep turning the pages.
When I was trying to decide who was going to be my guest for the K-9 and Company episode, there was only one choice, and that was the two gentlemen from the Who and Company podcast. So K-9 and Company meet Who and Company. Welcome to the show, Drew and Brent.
Affirmative.
Hello.
You had me on Who and Company a couple of months ago, and we discussed Doctor Who and Dark Shadows, my current binge watch obsession. And I am returning the favor and having you guys on. This is your first appearance for each of you with an asterisk, because we were all at LI Who last year. And Drew, I believe you were on my Doctor Who 60 for 60 panel as one of the panelists and also as the scorekeeper.
I'm sure I screwed that up royally.
It was interesting because of the 60 stories that I asked for, I got 61 results, and you as scorekeeper determined that 30 of them were classic series, 30 were new series, and one of them was the TV movie right in the middle. It was a perfect split.
Yeah. Kier got really excited, had to go leave early, and I think he nailed all of his in one time and went one over, and you were given the option to drop one, and I guess, why would you? 61 works perfectly.
Exactly. If you want 61 opinions, ask 60 Doctor Who fans.
Right.
Yes, Kier did give 11 stories. So having the TV movie in the mix definitely helped. When I mounted the same panel again at Gallifrey 1 in February, the new series did have a slight edge over the classic series, except that the first 4 stories given were all Hartnell stories. And I was kind of hoping for Hartnell to run the table, but that is not what ended up happening.
If you want Hartnell love, that is the group to get it from. I'm always very impressed by the folks who champion Hartnell stories. I mean, I understand why completely, but I actually just listening to your episode on the Romans, which was quite fun. And okay, so maybe I'm wrong by this. Brent, is this the first time that you and I have recorded together on a podcast that we are not regulars on?
It is.
There you go.
All right. This is a milestone for Doctor Who Literature listeners. So, Brent, what is Who and Company about for you?
Well, back in 2013, I had a podcast called The Quest is the Quest. And when that ended, I thought, I want to do another show, but I needed a unique angle. So I'm listening to other Doctor Who podcasts. I noticed that, especially right Friscaro, they get sidetracked a lot talking about other shows. So I thought, why not give people involved with Doctor Who another outlet to geek out about a favorite show? But I needed a partner, and Drew used to send in feedback on The Quest is a Quest. And it was always insightful. He had a really great radio voice. So I asked him, and he said yes. And this is our 8th year. We've done 84 shows so far with people like your good self and Sophie Aldred, Andrew Smith, Louise Jameson, William Russell. It's been a fun time.
Andrew Smith has been on this show twice and hopefully will be on again before I reach the end of the target run sometime in 2025. But it's interesting that you say that Drew has a voice for radio. I have a face for radio, but I have a voice for silent film, which makes podcasting a little difficult sometimes. And Drew, how many podcasts are you on in any given month?
That depends. At this moment, I'm actually trying to minimize the number of time commitments, but on average, it's between 3 and 5. It's dropped a little bit in recent years, but there was a time where I think in 1 month I recorded 10 separate Doctor Who and other kinds of podcasts.
Wow.
Yeah, I have a lot. I used to have a lot of free time, and I enjoy talking to people who are passionate about anything, particularly Doctor Who. So I'm always happy to be a part of the conversation.
I recently joked to Graham Burke when I was on the special that he did back in December for the Essentials of Doctor Who. I said, Graham, this is my 5th appearance on Reality Bomb, and when somebody's on Saturday Night Live for the 5th time, they get membership to the Five Timers Club and a green jacket. But alas, there is no Five Timers Club for Reality Bomb. But I believe in your case, you are the 100th Timers Club for Reality Bomb.
I have done, I don't know how many episodes, but Reality Bomb's the reason I got into Doctor Who podcasting from an audio level. Prior to that, I was on let's call it a podcast. It was essentially a YouTube podcast. We had done 200-300 episodes because there was no weekly schedules. Whenever we wanted to record, we just recorded and they uploaded it. And I was listening to Reality Bomb. I absolutely adored it. There was a number of podcasts I was listening to that I absolutely adored. Quest is Quest being one of them in 2012, 2013. And I got asked to do, I think Graham and I had been to a convention together, and he's like, "You've got a really good voice for radio. Could you be a slimy salesperson? Like a Troy McClure type?" And I was like, "It's the part I was born to play." And so I sent him. I didn't have any equipment, but I talked into my phone and I sent him the file, and he says, like, "That's great, but the audio recording's garbage. I need it in like 5 days. If you can send it in 5 days, great. If not, forget about it." And I was thinking, well, this is my chance to actually do some podcasting. So I quickly, hey, Doctor Who podcasters, who can give me recommendations for a microphone and headphone set or something like that? Of course, Stephen Shabansky immediately was like, "I know technical questions." They made some recommendations. I got my blue snowball, which is sitting in front of me 10 years later, and the rest is the rest. So yeah, it's. But I will say this, Jason, you have been on more episodes than I have as yourself. I have only been interviewed by Reality Bomb once as me. They did a special on the comedy sketches. It's the only time that I've essentially, I have been Drew Meyer, but only as a scripted Drew Meyer.
Yes.
I have never been asked, because usually they don't ask people who already have their own podcasts. I have never been asked to be on to give my opinion about anything, which I'm still one day very much looking forward to doing so. So we'll have to see. That'll probably never happen.
I think I have more appearances on Reality Bomb in the recurring fan attorney segment, because I have a recurring role as the judge, and you can tell that I am on the wrong side of 50 because I have totally forgotten the name of Kim's character as the fan attorney. And I've been, I think, on 3 or 4 of those segments.
Secret. I rarely read the other people's lines. But
it's literally the name of the segment is blank blank fan attorney, and I'm blanking out as to what the blank blank stands for.
It probably isn't blank blank, but
Yes.
yeah. I'm sure the internet would help us if we so wanted to pause this podcast and come back to it with the correct answer. Know that we have actually paused the recording to get that information.
This is what Darren Mooney on the 250 podcast calls the fact machine.
You need to have those beep, boop, 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 soundtrack.
Pam Brandeis, fan attorney, is the fact machine result.
There we go. That sounds correct.
And
I would never be able to pull that out of anything other than the fact machine.
And Brent, we were talking earlier, you also have a podcast called DWP, and this also marks me out as being on the wrong side of 50. I had to decipher what DWP stands for, and I drew a blank.
It's
So
the
what-
Doctor Who podcast. They've
The
been
DW I was able to figure out.
yeah, they've been around for many years. They took like a 5-year break. They came back around the same time we did. Drew and I are both on there now. We weren't on there before. We were asked to be on for the second incarnation, and that's been a lot of fun.
And when you say the quest is the quest, of course, I am kind of a patron saint for lost causes. My favorite Doctor Who stories tend to be the ones that most folks have either never heard of or loathe with a fiery passion. So when I hear that somebody has a podcast that takes its name from Underworld, I am
Right.
buoyed in spirit. What was The Quest is the Quest?
Well, it was my first podcast, and I started around February of 2013. It was the 50th anniversary, and I thought, what if I could watch all of Doctor Who in 1 year, well, basically in 10 months, in time for the 50th anniversary, and do like a season a week, roughly, and have a guest on sometimes, sometimes not, and do an episode like every Sunday. And I did. And I don't know how I got it done. I don't know how I'm still married, but it's still.
She enjoyed that break.
Yeah. But it was a success. It was a lot of fun.
See, I try to do the same thing in podcast form. So I had my Doctor Who novels blog at WordPress. And the Museum of TV and Radio, now known as the Paley Center in New York City, had done a special screening of An Unearthly Child, the 4-part story. And then later on, they screened the pilot episode, and they had Waris Hussein on site as a guest to do live commentary. So starting with that, I tried to watch one episode a night, starting at the beginning of 2013. My blog only made it as far as the Macra Terror, and I got halfway through a long-form post on the Faceless Ones when I gave up, and that was the end of that project. I did not manage to do the pilgrimage until the pandemic, when I did it on Twitter for my Doctor Who pilgrimage hashtag, and then I watched the entire series in about 2 years, 45 minutes a night. How you managed to do the entire run of 50 years and 52 weeks, you deserve a medal and a producer credit on this show. That is impressive.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, there was a lot of watching on breaks at work, watching on lunch hours, watching at home, watching it in the middle of the night, lots of that stuff.
And Drew, before we get to the book of the week, which of course I've already spoiled for eagle-eared listeners, what is your Doctor Who fandom journey? When did you come to the show? Who is your doctor? And what is your story with the novelizations?
Oh boy. Okay, so that's a lot. So I came to Doctor Who via the comic books. Yeah, in the early 80s. I was a comic book kid. I learned to read via the comic books, not the Doctor Who magazine serials. I mean, they were the ones that eventually got printed, but Marvel reprinted in the United States. I was a comic guy. I like science fiction. I had been told by a babysitter that Doctor Who was something I should watch. I never got around to it, but I was told that the Doctor is this guy. He's got a crazy grin. He's got a long scarf. He's got a robot dog. Fantastic, all those things. So I started reading those. Absolutely loved them. The problem was no one had explained regeneration to me. So when Baker became Davison comics, I was like, where did the Doctor go? I don't understand why they're calling this guy the Doctor. He must be an imposter. I was clearly missing issues. and I just put them down. I just gave up. Years and years later, I saw that there was going to be a Doctor Who movie. I taped it off the television. I watched it and rewatched it. So Paul McGann is my doctor. Is my first televised doctor. He's the one that I got into the show because of, and because I got to watch McCoy regenerate into McGann. I mean, I guess technically you could say that McCoy was my first doctor at that point in time, but he is not the one who left a lasting impression. He walked into a gunfight. What kind of a doctor is that? I prefer my doctors to the ones who are kiss girls. It doesn't matter. It made me interested in what the show was, but because this is pre-internet and I didn't know there were novelizations, I didn't know anything about Doctor Who outside of the 10 or so comics that I had. I went and got one of the Decades books and read that and went, oh, okay, I got the third and fourth Doctor books, and I kind of read the history of Doctor Who, and it seemed like that seemed really cool. But it wasn't until Doctor Who came back in 2005 that I had any kind of real interest in the program itself. And so I started watching the new series, and then let's see, Netflix had a couple of episodes. I tried to watch the 5 Doctors. It made no sense. I put it away. And then one day we moved to this town that had an amazing library that had all of the Doctor Who stories on DVD that had been released at that point. They were still releasing them. Within the system. North Carolina has an amazing system where you could order them from all over. And so I printed out a list of everything that was in order, and I started my pilgrimage, and it was all over the place. If an episode, I couldn't get the next episode, I get the next 4 ahead and watch it and then go back. And I rated each one, and it was around that time I discovered Doctor Who podcasting, started listening to that. So that's kind of where I'm at there. I'm all over the place, but I'm a relatively new fan. So like first episode 96 and not again until 2005. So, when people describe their journey, I always consider myself as a new Who fan who then rediscovered the classics.
See, I had the final 4 issues of the Marvel book, which came out in the early 80s. It ran, I believe, for 23 issues. So I started collecting in issue 20. My last one was 22, and then I got issue 23, the final issue, at a New York Comic-Con a couple of years ago. But I don't have the earlier issues. So did you start with Iron Legion, or did you start with the Star Beast, which has since come around again?
So when Marvel launched it started with Star Beast. So they skipped Iron Legion. It started with Star Beast, I believe. But the Star Beast is so Star Beast is my first Doctor Who story. Sharon Davies is my first Doctor Who companion. And I didn't read any of the others until in the last 10 years or so. I think IDW or Titan reprinted an omnibus version of all of them. And so that I went back and read it. While I would have collected them, I think at the time that I got back into Doctor Who, I had stopped collecting comic books, individual issues, and no one in the States had reprinted them. There was one version at one point in time, but it was hard to find.
Did the IDW reprints also have the backup strips? Because I know the very first issue that I had the backup Celestial Toymaker strip written by John Peel, who's also been on this show.
I don't know if they do. If they do, they are probably in an appendix at the back, so it's not in chronological order then. I think the most recent time I read them, and it might be another version of them, the one that I got, in fact, I want to say, when did I get those? Anyway, totally different story on that one. Robert Hack gave me an omnibus version that he had done a cover for fairly recently, and I went back and flipped through it. I think he actually, when we did our interview with him, he had said that the very first piece of published comic book art was a Doctor Who cover, which that sounds amazing. That's such cool. Of course, he's gone to do amazing things himself,
including the illustrated Doctor Who and the Daleks novelization.
Correct. Yeah, and he's done. I think Rose was another one that I think he did. So it's that illustrated is an illustrated novel. I think he's done 2 illustrated novels now, or maybe even 3. He might have. Yeah. Anyway.
And I believe the backup strips, so these are the Doctorless strips centered around Doctor Who villains and monsters, I believe there is a compilation that has just come out or is about to come out with those backup strips. And I believe Paul Scoons, friend of this show, has done the forward, but I don't have that volume yet. Maybe I can supply more information in the show notes.
One of our co-hosts, Michelle, has recently got into, for the DWP, has really gotten into kind of the history of the comics, and probably would know the answer straight off her head.
Right now, with Callie and I having finished Buffy the Vampire Slayer on TV, we've moved to Buffy the Vampire Slayer comics. We are reading simultaneously the Season 8 official continuation and the 2018 reboot put out by a different publisher. So those are the comics that I'm focused on right now rather than Doctor Who.
I own several pages from that original Buffy series for Season 8, and the Doctor makes an appearance in the very first issue, I think, or second issue of it. It's a full page of Giles in the library, but if you look out the window, you can see the Doctor and Rose and the TARDIS walking past. It was recently offered to me, and I couldn't afford it at the time. I am since regretting it, but I would be very interested to hear what you and Callie have to say about those issues, especially once they start getting into the third story arc. Fantastic story, but interesting things happen.
If you're talking about issues, I believe issues 11 through 14, we are about to get to that because we're in the middle of the second trade paperback. We just read issue 10 last night. Yeah. And I read them as they came out, but that's about 15 years ago now. And this is the first time that I heard there was a Doctor Who Easter egg in Buffy season 8. I'm going to have to go back and pull that because we would have read that issue recently, and I have no recollection of seeing that as a background detail.
Yeah. It's the upper left corner, if I'm not mistaken. We get to see outside of Giles' library, and you'll see the Doctor and Rose walking past.
And this is the 2007 Buffy season 8, or is this the 2018 reboot comic?
Season 8.
Wow, I'm going to have to go back and pull that. Wow. And Brent, same set of questions for you. Your Doctor Who origin story, your Doctor, your tale with the novelizations.
Well, I was in 4th grade, whatever year that was, and a new kid moved into town. And we became friends really quickly. And he was like, there's this really cool show on Channel 4, which was our PBS station, WUNC in Chapel Hill. And it's called Doctor Who. And it used to come on every night, every weeknight, I think, around 6:37, something like that. So I watched, I think the first episode I saw was Genesis of the Daleks. I don't remember which episode, like 1 or 2, something like that. And I was hooked right away. I was like, wow, this is really weird, really cool. I like it. So I watched it on through the years, and then, school, everything. You sort of get away from TV for a while you're growing up. And then in the early 90s, all of these started coming out on video. So I started collecting all the videotapes, and then the DVDs, and now the Blu-rays. So... So I would say, I love every actor that's played the Doctor. I love every Doctor in their own right. They're all different, even though they're all the same. And like Tom Baker said one time, nobody has ever failed in the part. That's totally true. And but I would say Tom Baker is my favorite, the 4th Doctor, just maybe because he was my first.
What fascinates me about both of your stories is that you both came to the show in large part thanks to physical media, which is almost an endangered species at this point. And I, of course, came to the show through PBS in the 1980s. I was doing off-air VHS types, which stoked my fandom, but it's amazing that the availability of physical media is kind of sort of what brought both of you here. And I'm wondering if in another generation from now, the next generation of podcasters will come to the show through streaming, such as on iPlayer or Tubi, which is the next generation of, or the replacement for physical media.
Mm-hmm.
Drew is giving me the hang 10 sign.
I am, and forever will be, a Tubi devotee. I search Tubi every month, and it's like being transported in a time machine back to the video store, especially for old, hard to find horror movies that I haven't seen the covers of. if I was allowed to get rid of all of the streaming services and just have Tubi, honestly, I would be satisfied. I think it would scratch every itch I have as a moviegoer. But I have interrupted Brent's story.
As I mentioned to Drew on Who and Company, Tubi is how I have been watching Dark Shadows. And when I gave Drew episode numbers to watch, I forgot that Tubi has the show under two different umbrellas. So he ended up, I believe, watching the incorrect episodes. But Tubi is also a great source for movies that are not available on the for pay streaming services. I've been working my way through the IMDb top 250 movies, and a lot of those are only available on Tubi. So I've been spending a lot of time there as well.
That's a great service, and the commercials are really short and far between it. Yeah, it's not really a nuisance. I have this thing where if I have time on the weekend, I'll watch like an 80s action movie on a weekend if I can, and they're always on Tubi. There's tons of them on there. Yeah, and good old TV shows too. Good old TV shows.
Chuck Norris Invasion USA is possibly one of the worst 1980s American action movies. I'm positive that's going to be on Tubi.
Oh,
I just picked it up on DVD fairly recently. I got a Chuck Norris box set at Goodwill recently.
Sweet.
I was like, yeah, I'll never watch a single one of these, but it's going in the physical media collection.
I ordered Invasion USA on 4K. It'll be here Tuesday. I'm very excited.
4K. Wow, that's lavishing attention on a production that quite possibly doesn't deserve it.
That is polishing a dog turd right there. But
dog turds in 4K. That's another podcast.
So Brent, I think we both cut you off. Did you want to talk about any elements of your fandom journey / novelizations?
Well, the novelizations I read, there were a lot at the local library when I grew up, where I was growing up, and it was around the time I was going to college, and I didn't stay on campus. I just went there for classes because I lived nearby. So there were a lot of 1 hour, 2 hour breaks between classes, and was no time to go home and come back. So I went to the library. That's where I found a bunch of Target novelizations of Doctor Who. I think I checked out pretty much all of them here and there, and that's what I did on my breaks. I would read Target novelizations in my car, waiting to go back to class. Yeah,
that's incredible. So we're kind of sort of cheating here on Doctor Who literature this week. We are covering a novelization, but it's a novelization of a spin-off episode that was made using Doctor Who season 19 production money, and that's why season 19 is 2.5 hours shorter than season 18. But K-9 and Company was a one-off Christmas special / backdoor pilot. And the novelization comes out 6 years later under a rapidly dying umbrella subsidiary to the novelizations called the Companions of Doctor Who. This is the third and final one of the series, and it's the only one that is not an original novel. So at this point, I'm going to let the two of you narrate the next segment of the show. I'd like you guys to discuss when you would have first seen K-9 and Company. I know that it was available as an optional PBS purchase for add-on in the mid-'80s. So I would have seen it on a couple of different PBS stations that were available on my Northeast American cable package. And I know it also came out as an extra to the Invisible Enemy DVD about 10, 15 years ago. I do not recall, and I didn't research if it was made available as a DHS, or as some people call it, VHS, those who like to call it by the proper name. So how did you guys first watch K-9 and Company, and had you read the novelization before I forced you to do so for this week's episode of Doctor Who Literature?
I could go first. I had not read the novelization for that one. Drew was kind enough to send me one, and so that's where I read it this time. Season 18 is my all-time favorite season of Doctor Who, and this was made during that time, like you said, and it's actually on the season 18 Blu-ray for anybody that hasn't bought that yet. But for some reason, I haven't watched this special very much, not very many times, so there was a lot I'd forgotten. I watched it again last week, as well as reading the book, but I do enjoy it. it wasn't popular, and I don't know why it didn't get picked up as a series. I wish it had. I don't know if it was just not popular or didn't get the ratings, or not sure. I'm sure you know where that came from, Jason. But
The ratings were actually great. The ratings, I believe, were better than any season 18 story, but it was internal politics and the departure of the two people who commissioned the show led to the replacement of two new people who didn't champion the show at all. And that's why it ended up being the only episode created. The ratings were fine. The politics, however, were fatal to K-9. And long-time listeners of this show know that this is a K-9 house. K-9 is my companion. He is my Doctor Who. I have a talking K-9 on my desk at work that I purchased at Forbidden Planet in 2018. And anytime I need validation at work, I will push the button on the back of K-9 and he will say, "Affirmative, Master."
Yeah, I watched this for the first time on said Invisible Enemy extra. So whenever I got a hold of that one, I'm going to guess it was either 2012 or 2013. It had already been released a couple of years prior to that. It was one of the rare 2-disc sets for, at the time, a very difficult to find DVD series. I don't know if the United States just had a very limited run with them. But like I said, my library had it. So I got it. I watched it. It's a weird 1-2 punch, Invisible Enemy followed by K-9 and Company. I'm not 100% sure why they decided to go with that route. Would that have just been the next one in the order? Is that how that works?
So Invisible Enemy was K-9's origin, but in broadcast terms, K-9 Company airs in between Logopolis, which is February 1981, and Castrovalva, January 1982. I think it aired the week before Castrovalva Part 1. It would be a very awkward extra to put on the Logopolis Castrovalva Keeper of Traken box set.
Well, that's what I was thinking. The box set wouldn't have made any kind of sense with that. So I'd forgotten that was K-9's first story. I'm not a huge fan of Invisible Enemy. I mean, it's fine. I didn't, like I said, I didn't grow up with the classic series, so I don't have the kind of nostalgic love for it that a lot of people do. It's a perfectly fine story. It's very enjoyable, but I just don't remember it as much. And I gotta say, there are very few Doctor Who classic stories that I've watched more than once. The ones that I truly, truly love, I have gone and rewatched them, and I'm slowly collecting them on the Blu-rays, like Brent has suggested, but only when I find a distributor who has it on sale, because $60 a pop is really steep. But yeah, right now my love and my life is hard to find movies, and so that's kind of what I'm devoting most of my attention to. I've already a DVD collection. I own them. I have every episode of the classic series. I will have them forever, so I'm just going to continue watching those. But we'll see what happens as far as rewatching. Yeah. And as far as the novelization is concerned, I picked it up. I didn't even know there was one until Who-Lanta in 2017. I saw it at a dealer's table, and I was like, "What? What are the chances of this?" I bought it. Sat on the shelf, and then I somehow managed to find 2 more copies. So when you said we were doing this, I sent an extra copy to Brent. But yeah, so
I did not buy this when it came out. My Doctor Who fandom was kind of losing steam because I got into the show in late 84, early 85. So by 1987, I was 13, going on 14. Other interests were beginning to percolate in my brain. Baseball and girls, but not necessarily in that order. So by the time K-9 and Company came out, I wasn't as interested in putting my money down on spin-offs or stories that I didn't consider part of my own Doctor Who headcanon. So I am reading K-9 and Company for the first time this week in preparation for this recording and episode. I purchased my copy from Dale Santos at Galley probably right before the pandemic, and it's been sitting in its original plastic bag unopened. So I am reading it for the first time, and I have my Nathan and Lee Pixel Who bookmark inside the book telling me where I am.
I'm so glad that you brought up Nathan and Lee, because the reason I have any novelizations is because of them. They're dear friends of mine, and the first time I went to their house, Nathan's like, well, I want to show you my office. And Nathan's office is a museum to Doctor Who literature. I mean, he owns, his goal is to own every book that's ever published, and considering he did work for some of the limited, very hard to find Doctor Who unofficial books that James Howe and such and company did, I was like, this is amazing. And he has them in chronological order. So it's all the novelizations are not together. He has them by this novelization goes here, and then there's a New Adventures, and then there's a Forgotten, and there's a whatever. These massive, massive shelves. I'm like, I didn't realize this was the thing I wanted to do. I love books. I love reading. I will start doing this. So now in my basement, I have got 5 or 6 30-gallon tubs filled with Doctor Who literature. I will never read. The flames of my fandom haven't died for the show in particular, but other things in my life have occurred where like I am waiting to unload this collection at a convention at some point in time, and there just hasn't been a close enough to me where I could set up a table and make some other fan's dreams come true.
It's funny that you mentioned Nathan's Doctor Who Literature Museum, because he recorded his episode of Doctor Who Literature from that self-same office.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
And he was in my episode on The Savages, the William Hartnell novelization.
Oh, that's one of the books I have. Excellent.
We arranged that at Galley back in February, where sadly Drew was not in attendance. And Eli Who is coming up in a few weeks, but sadly this will be the first Eli Who that I've missed since 2017. So if you guys will be there, I shall not.
Nope, it'd be the first Eli Who that I have missed as well.
Wow. So, Brent, I've been asking a lot of my listeners questions shamelessly stolen from Darren Mooney's The 250 podcast, and I will sidestep here with another edition from the Fact Machine. So it turns out that Drew has messaged me the page that the Doctor and Rose are on in the Buffy comic. And this is very embarrassing failure on my part and my daughter's part, because it is from a 4-part cycle called No Future for You via the Sex Pistols song. That is the second trade paperback volume of Buffy Season 8, written by Brian K. Vaughan, who also did my daughter's other favorite comic book series, Paper Girls. And we just read that particular issue maybe 2 or 3 nights ago. Neither one of us happened to notice the Doctor Who on that page. So when she gets back from summer camp, I'm going to have to show her that page again. We're clearly going to have to spend more time looking at the background art and less time acting out the dialogue bubbles. Big failure for both of us.
Well, in your defense, and one of the things that I had, forgotten about is because they are clearly supposed to be Tennant and Rose, but they're just different enough. And the TARDIS is not a TARDIS. It's an actual phone box, red phone box, but it's very clear who they're supposed to be. But, I think you're not expecting them to see them in Buffy.
No, we are guilty of acting out the we will alternate who are reading. So I'll be Giles, she'll be Faith, for example. But we totally missed that detail. But coming back to my 250 podcast questions, Brent, this is not a fair question at all, and I don't expect a serious answer. Does K-9 and Company belong on a list of the 60 best Doctor Who TV episodes of the last 60 years?
No. I like it, but no. Well, I guess for the main thing of the Doctor isn't in it. That would be my argument of 60 years of Doctor Who, and to have that on a top list of anything and the Doctor's not in it, I would say, unfortunately, no.
Now, I can usually tell what Drew is thinking from his behavior on camera. So when I mentioned Paper Girls, he made a heart with his hands. When I asked the question of you, does K-9 and Company belong on the list of the top 60, Drew gave a stone face as if he was cosplaying the Ogre from Stones of Blood. So, Drew, same question for you. Does K-9 and Company belong on a list of Doctor Who's greatest 60 TV episodes from its first 60 years.
Greatest, no. But I think if you were to, say, assemble a list of essential Doctor Who, and you were creating a representative list of what the show could accomplish, so not just the best stories, but, it's one of those things, you don't introduce someone to Doctor Who with the best story, because no other story is going to live up to that, whatever your best story is. It's like I'm sure you've discussed many times, you don't introduce someone to Doctor Who with Blink, because it's not typical of Doctor Who. I'm not saying Blink is the best episode, but it's one that a lot of people, certainly for a certain long time, people were recommending. But I think if you want to show what Doctor Who can accomplish, then K-9 Company is, it's kind of a Doctor Who story. I know it's its own separate series, but you don't have it without Doctor Who. And I think it would probably deserve to be on a representative list as the first Doctor Light episode of the classic series, and why companions are so important, and why sometimes it's important to have the Doctor, and sometimes how it can exist without. We get very few classic stories, maybe only one, where the Doctor is traveling solo, and you only have really one classic series where you've got companions traveling. Plus it's Sarah Jane. You can get more Sarah Jane. K-9's great as well, but this is not a good K-9 story. It's so, it's okay, but it's so. You touched upon my original thought when I was watching K-9 Company on PBS in the mid to late 1980s. I felt bad for K-9 because he must have been so bored living in a manor house, and there's no sci-fi element to the story outside of K-9 himself. It is a standard black magic coven running around up to no good. Your god they worship, standard black magic coven.
But the god they worship is not actually there. So unlike the Stones of Blood, where the Kaliach is actually there influencing them, these are just folks running around performing ancient rites, and K-9 has very little to do in the story apart from falling asleep reading books and singing Christmas carols. So I felt bad for K-9 as an in-universe character because he must have been very, very bored living this life, whereas Russell T Davies fixes that by giving him a lot more to do for the episodes that he is in for the Sarah Jane adventures, which, of course, is not every episode.
Well, and here's the thing. I loved the return of both Sarah Jane and K-9 to the modern series, but I hadn't seen, when I watched that episode, I hadn't seen the classic series, so I didn't really understand K-9 outside of the comic books. And what's fascinating about what is the Skrillatane story with the Sarah Jane returns in?
School Reunion.
School Reunion. What's fascinating about that?
Anthony Stewart Head from the Buffy comic.
From Buffy.
That's right.
Exactly. Right.
Yep.
What's fascinating about that is it's a sequel to K-9 and Company, because it's not a sequel to Doctor. So if anyone ever argues with you that K-9 and Company isn't a Doctor Who story because the Doctor's not in it, School Reunion is a sequel to that story. It's canon. It has to be canon within the universe, and it's sort of the first. Sure, it's the first spinoff, but it has been canonized by School Reunion, which I think is cool. And I would probably include both of those on a representative list for many different reasons. Krillatane, not Skrillatane. So, yeah.
This, of course, reminds me of the point that Stacey Smith and your fellow Reality Bomb voiceover specialist Bill Evenson made in their comedy book. Look at the size of that thing. The 50 Doctor Who stories that you'd rather die than watch. City of Death was on that list because if you show anybody City of Death as their first story, no other Doctor Who story will ever work again because everything else is terrible next to City of Death. So I started with Time Flight and Arc of Infinity, so I am used to not starting with the good stories.
So my long-suffering wife, we have a thing where if she has a kink in her neck and she needs a massage, I will massage her anytime she asks. But we get to watch whatever I want while it is happening. And nowadays it's Bluey, but previously it was classic Doctor Who that I hadn't seen. and she has seen City of Death 4 or 5 times, and Horror of Fang Rock probably twice that many. She's like, those are the only 2 Doctor Who stories I've ever seen, and it's always one of those 2, because those are my two of my favorite classics.
And that's where you have to. No other stories can match up to those 2. So I do not recommend that you show Claws of Axos or Invisible Enemy, or even Time Flight next. It would not be quite as good a positive experience.
No, agreed. My go-to classic introduction story is Carnival of Monsters. I think that's it's a good story. It shows what Doctor Who can be. It's a classic. So if you're afraid that janky special effects and costuming is going to scare people off, it's got all of that, but it's also, I think, just a perfect 4-parter that demonstrates almost better than any other Doctor Who story what a Doctor Who story can be, without falling under the headline of being, a masterpiece or a classic. I think it's kind of a middle of the road as far as people's opinion of it. Maybe, I don't know. I haven't done a lot of interviews or research about it, but that's usually the one I recommend for folks if they want to try something.
Carnival appears in Stacy and Graham Burke's book, The 50 Doctor Who Stories to Watch Before You Die.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Which is separate and apart from Stacy and Bill's list of 50 Doctor Who stories to die before you watch. So, Brent, how large does Sarah Jane Smith / Elizabeth Sladen loom in your fandom, and how does this story work as the first episode of the Sarah Jane Adventures 25 years early?
I was going to say that earlier, that if you did have this as an important, like Drew said, a very essential viewing of Doctor Who, that would be why for me, because it's kind of like the first Sarah Jane adventure. Sarah Jane has always been my favorite companion ever. So I will enjoy anything she's ever been in. I was a big fan of the Sarah Jane Adventures too.
And that brings us neatly to the novelization. I will be recording a review of the novelization, which will appear on the show directly after this interview concludes. And again, I'm reading it for the first time now, so I come to this with no preformed opinions. It's one of the very few Doctor Who books that I've never read before. Starting with Brett and then going over to Drew, how is K-9 and Company, the book, as a work of literature?
Well, as with all books, you get an insight into the character's thinking. I've read a lot of Terrence Dick's novelizations, and they're basically the scripts with a few insights thrown in, which I love because they're easy to read. But in this one, there are also extended scenes, if you will, like Brendan and K-9 talking about potatoes, and more Brendan and K-9's soil analysis, and more of like when Brendan does the whole honking thing. They go on and on about that afterwards. But I think that's because Terrence Dudley wrote the script and the novelization. So if anybody could expand a story, nobody better than the original writer. I did notice a couple of things that were maybe a little different than the TV adaptation. Was Sarah seems a bit grumpier in the book. I don't know if you thought that. A little bit out of character, I thought, for me. But yeah, I really enjoyed the book. It like I said, it's a maybe a 2-hour version of a 1-hour story.
Terrence Dudley is interesting. He was one of the oldest people to write a novelization. This is his third and final book. His first book was The King's Demons, where Tegan comes across very, very, very badly. And Drew, how about your experience with K-9 and Company, the book? Is this one of the best Doctor Who books ever written? If somebody comes to your desk and says, I need a recommendation for a Doctor Who book, is this the book you pull out of your shelf?
No, but keep in mind that my Doctor Who novelization reading is fairly limited. I had always planned to own all, however many of them there are, and then read them in order. one day, maybe even do a podcast about that. I am not going to do that now. It has been taken care of fairly well. So, that it does not, Doctor Who fandom doesn't need another one. Yeah, I like it. Actually, I like Terence Dudley's writing. I think the main things I find is that there's a little, like Brent said, it's a little extra padding in this. I think the scenes maybe go on a little too long. It is looking at a much quicker script. And so, fiddling out the 160 pages, I don't think it needs to be that along those lines. The thing that throws me off is there's a lot, especially early on, a lot of discussion of where places, like place names are, and I don't know them. So it was very hard for me to visualize. I keep on forgetting that people drive on different sides of the road. And like the descriptions of like certain highways, and I'm like, you just travel along this road. But I have an affinity for small town Satanism. I like folk horror. And so this book is sort of treated like as a family friendly folk horror story that what works for me is sort of that, but also what doesn't work for me is we have a lot of scenes where the reader is privy to what is happening in the scenes where the protagonist isn't. I prefer a point of view story because it unleashes more of a mystery, though this is sort of a whodunit as well in a sense. So, and I like the style actually. I would recommend it if someone wanted to have an idea of what my own writing style was like. The only prose that I've ever published are pulp, kind of supernatural pulp action stories, and Dudley's style is kind of similar to my own in some senses, because language is such a fun. The words are great. I like playing around with language, and that they really Dudley really throws in a bunch of fun phrasing. I mean, it's a talky story though. There's a lot of talky to it, and it's Philip Marlowe with ain't. So yeah, it's not bad.
Philip Marlowe was also a very big influence on Terrence Dicks, but Terrence has a very different writing style to Terrence Dudley.
Yeah, agreed. I've read more Dicks novels than probably any of the other novelizations one, but that makes sense. So
when I met Terrence Dicks at the second LI Who in 2014, I think that was before I had met either of you guys, I told Terrence Dicks that I read more books by him than I had of Dickens or Bronte, and he was visibly embarrassed.
I came to that was my first LI Who. I came to that convention, walked in, was accosted by 4 people wearing Fraser Hine masks, then was promptly rescued by Dick Mills, who asked me if I wanted to go have breakfast with him. And as we were sitting and chatting, he goes, "Isn't that right, Terrence?" And I realized that Terrence Dicks was sitting next to me with a newspaper up over his face. And he kind of like dropped the newspaper, looked at us and goes, and then newspaper came back up. I will never forget that first morning from the first LI, my first Doctor Who convention. Kind of amazing. But I also got a chance to talk with Dix, and I mean, for someone who wasn't really familiar with the classic series up until 2 or 3 years prior to that, I was tongue-tied. I really was starstruck meeting Terrence Dicks. I met a lot of really impressive people that day, that weekend. But wow, that was, I mean, for me, writers are always going to be the people I admire most, because I have an understanding of how difficult of a skill and an art form that is. I couldn't tell you what it's like to be an actor. I don't know how difficult it is. But I can tell you a good story, especially a short story. Wow. Writers are the best. And Terrence Dicks was kind of exceptional. I mean, say what you will about him as far as the oeuvre of Doctor Who's novelization, but I mean, the guy knew how to write, and he knew how to write a novelization that I think inspired a lot of us to be early readers. I mean, that's one of the most popular things I hear from Doctor Who fans who came to the show, maybe not because of the show, but through the books. Again, physical media, tying it back. I am a librarian, so that's the other thing too. I work with books all day long, so that's sort of like my highest regard is usually reserved for writers.
Terrence Dix can often say more in 10 words than Terrence Dudley can say in a full paragraph. There's an interesting point of comparison between the two men, and I'll try and explore that a little bit more in my audio essay after this interview. But what it's time for now on Doctor Who Literature is time for a game. The game we are going to play this week, this is a game that I've been meaning to play the next time that I have two guests on my show. We're going to play 20 questions, which has not been played on Doctor Who Literature in a while. Using 20 yes or no questions, you are going to guess which Doctor Who episode title I have pulled out of the randomizer.net, which is a production of the Flight Through Entirety podcast. Any Doctor Who serial between 1963 and 2024. But I'm going to ask each of you to give me alternating 20 questions, and it's a different answer for both. So Brent will go first with question 1, then we'll go to Drew question 1, Brent question 2, Drew question 2, and each of you has a different story to guess. Are you ready to play this dastardly game which only one person has ever failed in the history of this show?
Well,
Sure. No pressure.
get ready.
Brent, my friend, what is your first question?
What is my first question?
A yes or no question to try and guess which Doctor Who story episode I've picked out of the randomizer.
Oh, I get you. The Web Planet.
Oh, so you are going, instead of trying to narrow it down, you are going to pick one story out of the entire catalog and hope that's the right answer. Because if you get it right, you'll have gotten it in one, and no Doctor Who literature guest will ever be able to top you. But sadly, the answer is no, it is not the Web Planet. You will have to go back to the drawing board for question number 2. Drew, for your first question, are you going to have the same gambit?
No, I'm going to ask you if this is a classic series Doctor Who story.
Yes, it is a classic series Doctor Who story. So Brent's first answer is no. Drew's first answer is yes. And now while Drew tries to worry about his second question, Brent is going to ask his second question.
Okay, I'm on board now. I know what we're doing. I'm
going to say this now, Brent. If mine turns out to be the Web Planet, I'm going to be very upset.
Is this a classic story?
In the literal meaning of the term, is it a classic series story from 1963 to 1989? Brent, the answer is no. So you have 2 no answers.
Okay.
And Drew, how about your good self?
Is this a black and white story? Assuming we were talking about the television, right? Was this originally in black and white?
You know that it's a classic series story, so you have a decade of black and white and 2 decades of color. You were trying to narrow down, and you have your second yes answer in a row. It is a black and white story, and in 2 questions, you have knocked Doctor Who from 60 years down to 7. So Drew is slated to finish long before Brent, but Brent can always make a spirited comeback if he gets a right answer on question number 3.
Is this a Peter Capaldi story?
So you know that it is a new series story, and you have, I believe, 6 doctors to narrow your way down. You are starting with Capaldi, but sadly, this is your 3rd consecutive no answer. It is not a Peter Capaldi story.
Oh, wow.
So while you're 0 for 3, Drew is trying to go 3 for 3. Drew, what is your 3rd question?
Listen, Brent's my podcasting partner. I'm gonna try to stall a little bit. So I have to ask the obvious question: is my story Web of Fear?
So having narrowed the show down to 7 years and 2 questions, you are now going to go story by story.
No,
sadly,
I'm not. I'm gonna do it just this once, just in case. Like I said, I'm gonna feel like a fool if it turns out to be so.
If you were right, you would have gotten it in 3, which would have made you the all-time champion of 20 questions. But sadly, lamentably, the answer is no. It is not the Web of Fear. Drew, Brent, this is your chance to pull ahead. Brent, what is your 4th question?
Is this story before 2010?
So you're asking if it is a story from the RTD run from April 2005 through January 1st, 2010.
Yes.
And the answer is no, it is not from the RTD run. That's 4 consecutive no answers, by the way, but you're getting closer to the truth because now you've narrowed it down to one of 3 or 4 different TV doctors. Drew, having struck out on the Web of Fear, do you want to take another wild guess and try and win it in 4, or do you want to just narrow it down further?
I'm going to ask you if this is a Dalek story.
It is not a Dalek story, which does narrow down a chunk of the 60s for you. There's a lot of Daleks in 62, but it is not a Dalek story. Brent, on question number 5, can you get your first yes answer?
Yes. Let's see. Is the Doctor a male?
And we have broken your streak. Yes, the Doctor is a male.
All right.
So that rules out all 3 seasons of Jodie Whittaker, and that makes your next question that much easier. You've narrowed it down to Matt Smith and John Hurt and Ncuti Gatwa. Drew, can you break your streak of 2 straight no answers on question number 5?
Is this a Cyberman story?
Having struck out with the Daleks, you are now going to the other big bad of 60s Doctor Who. And yes, it is a Cyberman story. That makes Drew's job a lot. Now Drew is guaranteed to win because
pretty much
he has fewer stories to guess from than guesses left. Question number 6, Brent, where are we at?
Is this a Matt Smith story?
You want to know if it's a Matt Smith story. You're looking at the available doctors and you say, make mine a bow tie. Yes, it is a Matt Smith story.
Excellent.
Now, I'm curious to see if Drew is going to get it on question 6 or if he's going to go story by story, throwing darts at the various Cyberman epics to see if he can get it that way. Drew, where are we?
Is this a story?
I'm sorry, I did not hear the question.
I know, there's only one, right? So, is this a Patrick Troughton story?
No, it isn't. Well, it is not a Patrick Troughton story.
Oh,
Patrick
wow.
Troughton is in it, but it is not a Patrick Troughton story, which is not a giveaway because you've narrowed it down to a single story, and that will be question number 7. But the answer to question 6 is no. Now, since Drew is essentially guaranteed to win on question 7, unless he asks a very foolish question, Brent, are you going to be able to tie Drew, and can you get it in 1?
Can I get it in 1? Is it Day of the Doctor?
No, it is not Day of the Doctor.
Wah, wah.
And Drew, I think I know what your question 7 is, but I'm not going to give it to you that easily. Ask me your 7th question.
I'm trying to decide if I need to end this game now or should give Brent some more chances.
No.
Is it Does this episode have a piece of clothing that would later show up in a Star Wars film?
When I was a young lad playing with my Empire Strikes Back figures, my favorite figure was Bosk, who is seen in exactly 1 camera shot of Empire Strikes Back, but he has a lizard face and a protruding red tongue and a very distinctive jersey. And my sister popped the head, my kid sister, who would have been 6 years younger than me, popped the head off of Bosk. And my father crazy glued Bosk's head back on so that Bosk's head never turned. and I was very upset. And it wasn't until years later that I'd learned that Bosk's outfit was actually first seen in other BBC outer space productions, most notably The 10th Planet. So, as I later became a 10th Planet fanboy, I didn't know that my Star Wars Bosk action figure was cosplaying as the 10th Planet astronauts. So yes, this is the Doctor Who story that features a character wearing Bosk's outfit from Empire Strikes Back. And I can see across the room my container that has my Empire Strikes Back action figures. My headset flex is not long enough to get me there, so I will not show it to you during this recording, but I'm sure Drew has it at hand.
You asking me if I have a Bosk action figure at hand?
Yes.
I can't reach it, but I mean, I have one downstairs in my my Darth Vader helmet carrying case.
Oh, I have one of those.
Yeah.
I have a metal. My wife got me 3 metal lunchboxes: Star Wars, Empire, Return of the Jedi, and I have each of the action figures in each lunchbox. So that is where Bosk is. He's in my Empire lunchbox. So Drew is a winner at 7 questions. Brent, you still have 13 to go. What is your 8th question?
Does this story feature Clara?
No. Question number 8. Sorry, question number 9, I should say. And now you've narrowed it down to 1 female companion.
Yeah. So does this story take place in season 5?
And for reference, season 5 is Matt Smith's first TV season.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Excellent. Does this story feature weeping angels?
Yes, it does. And there's only one possible answer, but you're going to have to name the story.
Time of the Angels.
Yes, Time of the Angels on Flesh and Stone. So Drew got it in 7, Brent got it in 10. Drew is the winner, but you're both winners because you both got it in the first half.
Hooray.
After Brent got off to a rocky start, Brent recovered nicely. All right, so we have successfully navigated our first joint 20 questions session. Where can we find each of you on the internet, starting with Brent?
You can find us on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, at Who and Company. You can also email us at whoandcompany@yahoo.com. We're available on pretty much everywhere. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, anywhere. We're also on the DWP.
And Drew, my 6-week podcast backlog has me up to Reality Bomb 117, which I'm positive you're in. Apart from Who and Company and Reality Bomb, where else can you be found?
So Who and Company, Reality Bomb, the Doctor Who podcast, and if you are, like, I think all 3 of us can safely say, if you were a movie lover, I do have a podcast called Never Say Die, which is a movie review podcast for the first half. And then if you also like role-playing games, think about how you can capture the truth of the movie in a way that allows you to play the spirit of that film as a role-playing game. So we discuss games in general, but specifically role-playing games. And our first season is Kids on Bikes films, so Kid Ventures, all of the Goonies, Attack the Block, stuff like that, Stand By Me. And our second season, which we're about halfway through, is heist films, which is a much broader category and a little harder to nail down and has a much wider net to cast. And we are making our way through that.
Well, it goes to offer myself up as a guest for other podcasts, but even though I am much more of a movie person than an RPG person, I think I might enjoy picking a film from one of those categories.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's see what we can do.
And I intend to have both of you guys back on as joint guests before Doctor Who literature reaches its final end point. K-9 and Company is adjunct to book 120. So this is episode 120A or 120 subprime. The last book is number 156. I have not booked the last dozen or so episodes of the show. I will try and have you both back on one last time. It is my intention after Doctor Who literature ends to do a Hartnell podcast week by week, starting with the pilot, going one episode part each week until I hit Adventure in Space and Time. And if I do that adventure, I'll have a guest on for a 4-week residency before moving on to the next guest, often crossing over stories. So I will, if that podcast happens, I will also have you down as guest for that. I want to thank you both so much for your time tonight.
Oh, thank you so much. This is really a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Jason.
Thank you for setting it up for the first chapter book that I have read for fun in 2 years.
Wow.
Between grad school and the fact that I read, a couple hundred books a week, but it's or a month because it's all children's books. I guess as a librarian, I haven't read a chapter book for fun in a very long time. And this was like, I finished and I was like, wow, there you go. Done and done.
Since
For me,
my
it's been-
last, so this is my last novelization episode was The Romans, where I discussed the recent children's classic Peanut Butter and Cupcake. I have to ask, have you read that to your library kids?
So I haven't, but after listening to that episode on the Romans, which was very erudite, I ordered a copy, and I think I got a message recently saying that it has arrived. It should be sitting on my desk tomorrow. So I'm looking forward to looking for all the misrhymed combinations.
Your mission, if you choose to accept it, is to do a flashcast Doctor Who lit episode just on Peanut Butter and Cupcake.
Well, it won't get to you for several weeks, but I'll see what we can do after that.
I will drop that into whatever Doctor Who literature episode comes next after I receive your flashcast by MP3.
Okay. All right.
All right. Again, thanks again to both. This has been a blast. After the break, Jason will review K-9 Company, the book by Terence Dudley. Stay tuned. The Companions of Doctor Who, K-9 and Company, written by Terence Dudley, televised as A Girl's Best Friend, teleplay by Terence Dudley, from a storyline by John Nathan Turner and Anthony Root, screen credit to Terence Dudley, televised on December 28, 1981, paperback release date October 15, 1987, cover artist Peter Kelly. In the sleepy village of Hazelberry Abbas, the winter solstice is fast drawing near. It is a time of deep mystery and ancient evil. Sarah Jane Smith, journalist and former companion to the Doctor, comes to Hazelberry Abbas to start work on her new book. While there, she meets Brendan, the young ward of her Aunt Lavinia. Suddenly, Brendan disappears. Has he been kidnapped by the practitioners of black magic who are said to live in the village? Is he to be sacrificed to the goddess Hecate on the winter solstice? But Sarah is not alone in her search for Brendan. Across the unimaginable gulfs of time and space, the Doctor has sent her a very special companion, a robotic dog by the name of K-9. Recently, we covered Donald Cahn's novelization of The Romans, numbered episode 119 of this podcast. That was Cotton's third and final novelization. We'd already discussed Cotton's prose style extensively in the DW Lit episodes covering Cotton's two earlier books, the novelizations of The Mythmakers and The Gunfighters, so we talked a little less about that third book. And now we come to Terence Dudley's novelization of the failed K-9 and Company series pilot. This is Dudley's third and final novelization. We've already discussed Dudley's prose style, such as it is, extensively in the DW Lit episodes covering Dudley's two earlier books, the novelization of The King's Demons and of Black Orchid. The plan is to talk a little less, slightly, about this third book. Dudley's prose style is reliant upon excessive verbiage, and his books often depart pretty far afield from their TV parents. That's kind of similar here, as you can tell from the back cover blurb, which changes the story's locale from Morton Harewood to something called Hazelberry Abyss. Although this is the first, and of course final because it's his last one, Doctor Who novelization to not extensively rewrite the end of the parent TV episode. Let me give you some sample prose from page 8. The book opens, as does the TV story, with a black magic coven, reenacting the opening scenes of the Stones of Blood from a few years earlier. The female priestess of the coven was said on page 7 to have, quote, anomalous female arms. That is either your punk band name or J.K. Rowling's take on the 2024 Summer Olympics medalist, Iman Khalif. And here on page 8, we get this gem, quote, hissing as if in acknowledgement of the salutation, the torch drenched the goat mask in ochreous light which penetrated the penumbrous voids to reveal fanatical eyes. That's page 8, and the book goes on through page 160. It is inevitable that we are going to have to discuss the book's prose over the rest of the book, but I will try not to overdo it. I think you get the picture. I made the same reference when I talked about Donald Cotton's sometimes belabored humor in The Romans. This book reads much like the Norman Mailer novelization of Itchy and Scratchy the movie, the novel. By the way, this is the final book to go out under the Companions of Doctor Who banner, and it's easy to see why. And it's not even an original novel, as the previous two had been, Tony Attwood's Turlough and the Earthling Dilemma, and the late Ian Marter's Harry Sullivan's War. We'll go chapter by chapter. Chapter 1, Exit Aunt Lavinia. Page 11, Dr. Lavinia Smith is both, quote, strikingly handsome and, quote, undoubtedly middle-aged. On the same page, Juno Baker is, quote, blessed with a dark, ageless beauty, with more than a hint of the voluptuary flowing from her well-poised head to the tips of her Gucci shoes. And there you have it, the first Target book in the now 15 calendar years of the line to reference Gucci.
Our Arts and Crafts Center is, in actuality, a Dickensian workhouse.
Come on, wimps! These Gucci wallets have to be on the streets of Hong Kong by Friday!
Back in The King's Demons, episode 107 of this podcast, we talked about Dudley's regrettable way of handling Tegan. This material also reeks of misogyny, hopefully of the accidental variety. Also in the chapter, a chimney breast is noble, and a room is not just dominated by book-lined walls, but is warmly dominated. This chapter captures the TV dialogue nearly word for word, apart from changed location names throughout the book, but it's in the endless adjectives and value judgments about its lady characters where the reading becomes a challenge. Chapter 2, Enter Sarah Jane. The staircase in Aunt Lavinia's home, again Hazelberry Abyss for the book and not Morton Harewood, is, quote, self-important. This chapter is told from Sarah Jane's impatient and ADHD-addled point of view. She mentally curses out a slow woman driver before realizing it's an old man with long white hair. We learn that she's been held hostage in Ethiopia while covering the famine, which happened after the TV episode was produced but before the book came out, although the book later says that it takes place in 1981. There's a jarring POV shift on page 23, as Dudley jumps over to Brendan, who in the book is 14 years old. Chapter 3, An Invitation, more unreadable prose, page 27. Quote, irritation, prompted by an unstilled persistent anxiety, provoked Sarah Jane into a display of impatience. And Deadly Dudley's pretentious predilection for arrogant alliteration rears its unintentionally hilarious head on page 30. Quote, the salivating savage instantly snapped shut the stretched upper snout with sniveling servility. Or, more simply put, Jasper the dog has stopped barking. Apart from the too many words, this chapter adds a moment not on TV, a near car crash as Sarah Jane is driving Brendan home from the train station, similar in my mind to the near crash in episode 1 of Planet of the Spiders as Sarah and Mike Yates were driving from the train station in darkest Mummerset, but I doubt Dudley had that particular moment in mind when he was writing this scene. Chapter 4, A Gift from the Doctor, page 43, and this is from the Department of Redundancy Department, quote, "A flabbergasted Sarah Jane looked incredulously at the mechanical talking dog. One of those two words needs to go, either flabbergasted or incredulously, because they both can't live in the same sentence, which is why the overwriting in this book is so frustrating. K-9 doesn't appear until page 43, and he's literally the reason for the book, the only illustration on the front cover. That's just too darn long a wait. Sarah Jane spends much of this chapter mentally criticizing poor Brendan, which I assume is Dudley just broadcasting his own thoughts about the actor through Sarah's POV. Chapter 5, The Black Art, page 57, Brendan reflects, quote, "If K-9 had one blemish, it was his voice. It was very monotonous and did go on." End quote. Sheesh. Dudley is one of those writers who thinks the sound of someone's voice is a reflection of their character. This happens a lot throughout the book. Now, for many of us, John Leeson is the appeal of K-9, and here is Dudley harshing on what would have been the title character of the series, for which he himself has been hired to write the pilot episode. But since this episode is not meant to be a hate read of the K-9 and Company novelization, I will give credit to. The Sarah Jane Lily Gregson scene in this chapter features Lily talking about how the village is so traditional that some people in it date back to the Roman occupation 2,000 years earlier. But she is herself, quote, "a foreigner. My lot didn't come here until the Civil War." The chapter ends with the TV moment where George Tracy is spying on Brendan. For the cliffhanger, Dudley writes, page 59, quote, "George Tracy, descendant of Publius Trescus of the 10th Legion, watched the latest invader violate his land." That's the first sentence in the book to excite me. Chapter 6, A Warning, more K-9 bashing, page 66. Brendan had, quote, "come to the conclusion that inheriting this miniature mechanical monster wasn't as exciting as he first thought." Next page, quote, "For a fraction of a second, Brendan carefully considered kicking the little beast to the other side of the room." Now, that is, of course, what Bill Fraser did in episode Meglos from TV's season 18, and Bill Fraser plays Commander Pollock in this story. Chapter 7. Oh, and by the way, Terence Dudley directed Meglos, so there may be a connection there. Chapter 7, in case you missed it, is even more clear about the author's divided loyalties to his double paycheck, the TV script, and the book. It is called, quote, "Chapter 7, K-9 Blunders." And boy, is K-9 made especially stupid by Dudley on page 71, unable to find his human quarry because his sensors can't distinguish the body temperature of humans versus, quote, "horses, cattle, sheep, and pigs." Then later down the same page, he mistakes a garden gnome for George Tracy. Speaking of the estimable Mr. Tracy, Dudley harshes on the man's housekeeping skills on page 77 because in his cottage, the woman's touch is, quote, "conspicuously absent." Dang, dude. Dudley also adds a subplot where Brendan is perpetually hungry, shades of TV's Adric, and makes a mess of potato peeling, which Sarah Jane has assigned him to do. There's an ethnic slur used to compare Peter Tracy's features to someone of Romani origin, but that line is ported over direct from TV. Dudley was 68 when the paperback was released, likely was not sophisticated or modern enough to understand that he was using what's come to be a slur. Chapter 8, A Confrontation. I read somewhere, or more likely I just made it up while typing this paragraph earlier, that every writer, ever, wants to be Arthur Conan Doyle. Dudley, who is so old that he was still alive when the final Conan Doyle Holmes adventures were published, gets his inner Sherlock on page 86, when Sarah Jane deduces that George Tracy broke into her home after he betrays no surprise when she informs him of the invasion, to which Dudley adds for the book an extra beat where Sarah Jane casually mentions that Peter Tracy, who she knows to be one of the culprits, is missing, just to gauge how George and General Grugger will react to the news. And then there was the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime. Of course, given that K-9 is one of the subjects of this whole exchange, the Tracys having mistaken him for an agent of Hecate. Chapter 9, Brendan is Taken. A good chunk of this chapter doesn't appear on TV. A concerned-sounding phone call from General Grugger, i.e. Bill Pollock, giving what sounds like friendly advice to Sarah Jane, though we can later deduce that the call had a sinister ulterior motive. Brendan is also abducted by both Tracys, not just Peter, and in a different and more elaborate way than on TV. You can imagine Eric Sayward script edited that down for convenience. This is followed by several invented and labored dialogue exchanges, trying to get K-9 to learn how to say goodnight in English, rather than greeting reciprocated. Chapter 10, K-9 goes undercover. Dudley continues his theme of making unbearable every lead character in the proposed K-9 and Company series by having Sarah on page 98 refer to Brendan as a, quote, lazy brat. Otherwise, this chapter continues to play Bill Pollock up as a good guy, as we see him driving Sarah Jane to the police station and warning her about the local political perils of accusing George Tracy to the police, though again see above re ulterior motive. There's also a discussion in the book of the church-going habits of Lily Gregson and Sarah Jane herself. I'll come back to that in a moment or two. Chapter 11, Human Sacrifice. On page 21, Sarah Jane bursts into tears, and not in a compassionate, milk-of-kindness human way that the Ncuti Gatwa doctor did for the 2024 TV season of Doctor Who The Mothership. Here she does it out of frustration and anger. Not very compelling behavior for a plucky 1980s citizen detective series like we saw so many of on American TV, like Heart to Heart, or Cagney and Lacey, or The Scarecrow and Mrs. King, or Remington Steele. Commander Pollock continues to be Sarah Jane's companion and advisor in most scenes in this chapter, in a way that he was not on TV. Chapter 12, Hallstock. The extra space by page and word count does give the story a little more time to breathe organically. Commander Pollock's disappearance is discovered in the book in real time by Sarah Jane on page 126, whereas on TV she only reports it secondhand to the Bakers in a later scene. Now, of course, in the book this also leaves more time for Sarah Jane to cry and argue with K-9, both of which happen again in this chapter with no positive impact, and exactly none of which happened on TV. Chapter 13, Evil Under the Moon. Gotta tell ya, cool chapter title. During her investigation of the churches in this chapter, more detailed than what we saw on TV, Sarah Jane actually prays at a church on page 142. Now this is of no interest to me whatsoever in terms of the character. I like my Doctor Who firmly in the secular world, but if this makes the character work better for you, then I'm genuinely pleased. Also, in terms of new Sarah Jane trivia, we learn on page 145 that she earned a black belt in karate, and there's an extended car chase sequence that would have been not possible to achieve on TV, given the budget. The epilogue is a bit shorter than what we got on television, and doesn't leave us much time to process the revelation that Lily Gregson, who was barely in the book, and Commander Pollock, who again was in almost all of the book, were the bad guys all along. The TV epilogue had given Aunt Lavinia some dialogue explaining that Pollock was behind most of the attempts to misdirect Sarah Jane, and in the book, K-9 finishes by singing a different Christmas carol than he does on television, to which I say, even though it is early August in the middle of the Summer Olympics, 2024, Happy Christmas to all of us. Oh, and incidentally, a Happy Christmas to all of you at home.
You wish we a merry, reject. We wish you a Merry Christmas. We wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Next time on Doctor Who Literature, it is the end of the Jon Pertwee era for the Target books. One of my favorite all-time Doctor Who stories, and a Terrance Dicks novelization that is, quite frankly, a darn sight easier to read than any of the 3 Terrance Dudley books that we've covered on this podcast between episodes 107 and this one. Joining me once again are going to be 2 guests in the same episode. I am planning on having a particular husband and wife team of Doctor Who novelists in an interview not yet recorded as I write this, so I will not give the names, but I'm sure you can guess who I am talking about. Next week, Doctor Who and the Ambassadors of Death. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Doctor Who Literature. The executive producer is David Barsky. The podcast is produced by Jim Sangster and yours truly. This week's episode was written and edited by me. Our logo was designed by Jim Sangster. Special thanks to my special guests, Drew and Brent from Who & Company. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/Doctor Who Lit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Blue Sky and YouTube at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, and on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature@gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.